So what I want to do is I want to look at some hidden gems of astoundingly good science all throughout the scriptures. So let's start at the very beginning. We looked at it just a moment ago, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. But does the Bible know best? All right, well, let's take a look. In the beginning, that's time, the very creation of time itself. God created the heaven, well, there's space, and the earth, there's matter. So the origin of time, space, and matter seems to be found in the very first verse of Scripture. We're getting off to a pretty good start. Sounds pretty scientific to me.
But it's not, actually. It's a pretty vague statement that you're applying scientific principles to. That doesn't make it scientific.
But you know what? We're told these days, many cosmologists think that around 14 billion years ago, a Big Bang sort of exploded or rapidly expanded, and it created the space and time we see around us. Here's the thing, though. It doesn't answer the question, where did the matter come from? And the Big Bang cosmology has no good answer to that.
Again with the creationist Big Bang. The Big Bang wasn't the beginning of the universe. It was the expansion of a singularity into the universe as we know it today. Mass nor energy never came into existence. It always existed. It was in the singularity before the Big Bang.
There has to be someone to create matter because it doesn't spontaneously burst into existence. That's against laws of nature. I think that the Bible knows best. It had it figured out, and it tells us about the origin of time, space, and matter.
You're right. It doesn't spontaneously burst into existence. Nor does it do it by intelligence. It didn't happen at all, and you can't just assert that it did. You need to show evidence that there was a beginning to all mass and energy.
So let's look at Jeremiah 8. Jeremiah 8 says, "Yea, the stork in the heaven knoweth her appointed times." It says, "and the seabird and the crane and the swallow." Well, the Arctic tern is a seabird or a sea swallow with an estimated global population of about 1 million. But what's so extraordinary is their migration course, because every year they will travel on a very particular migration course. And they'll start out in, say, Greenland or the Netherlands right up here, and they'll take a path southward along the African coast. Now, once they get to the southern tip of Africa, they'll turn and they'll go eastward some more to Australia, sometimes New Zealand. And then they'll turn south again and come down to Antarctica. They spend our winters, their summers in Antarctica, and when it's time to move north again, they migrate in an S-shaped path along the coast of the Americas to end up exactly where they were the previous year. So that means that these little birds are traveling about 1.5 million miles in their lifetime. That's pretty spectacular. Does the sea swallow know her appointed times? Does she know exactly where to go, what to do? I think she does. I think the Bible knows best.
This is actually a pretty easy explanation. They know when to migrate because they know when it's too cold. From there, they just start flying and keep flying as long as they see land on their left side. This isn't advanced scientific knowledge. The only thing that it takes for somebody to write something like this down is for them to see that at certain seasons, at certain times of the year, there are birds that are moving in predictable locations. This is just an observation.
So let's look at another one. Psalm 139:16 says, "Thine eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect, and in thy book all my members were written, which in continuance were fashioned, when as yet there was none of them."
I challenge you at home to stop for a minute and think about what that might mean, because that hardly even makes sense, and he's going to make sense of it for you.
So listen to the verbiage here. It says, "Thine eyes did see my substance, book, members, written, continuance, fashion." It sounds almost like a language, a written language.
Well, to you, because that particular wording is so vague that you can interpret it pretty much any way you want.
Well, DNA can be expressed as a written language, and it basically is the blueprints, the book that makes you who you are.
All right, he's going to go on and explain that this verse is talking about DNA. But, as I said, the wording is extremely vague and unhelpful. That's because he's using the King James Version of the Bible. But if we use a different version of the Bible, of which I have two over here that say the exact same thing, it says, "Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be." So in other more reliable translations of the Bible, you figure out that that verse is actually talking about unborn children and how God knows how long they are going to live before they're even born. None of which has anything to do with DNA and none of which is scientific.
Take a look at your thumbprint. Each one on each different hand is slightly different. There's not another one like it on planet Earth. That makes you thumbody. We're fearfully and wonderfully made. Okay, so Leviticus 17 says the life of all flesh is the blood thereof. Now, when I was researching this, I realized, I said, we've got a problem. Some creatures don't have blood. And I said, this can't be. No, the Bible knows best. What am I missing? What am I missing? And then I realized it says flesh. Very specifically, it says flesh. So I thought about it, and you know what? The creatures that don't have blood don't have flesh. Like sea sponges, things like that. So it's entirely accurate to say that the life of all flesh is the blood thereof.
Well, this is a bit troublesome because you never define blood and you never define flesh. So assuming that blood is blood as we know it and flesh is muscle, then insects as well as flatworms do have muscle but do not have blood. But this verse isn't exactly groundbreaking. It's not that hard to believe that people like that could see animals that bleed and realize that, hey, they're dying. Blood must be pretty freaking important.
But it hasn't been that long ago, colonial times, when bloodletting was a common practice. They would take blood out of patients to try to heal them, instead of going to the Creator above, Yahweh, the God of the Bible.
I've talked about this before. In fact, most of everything that I talk about now, I have talked about before. But you misunderstand bloodletting. Bloodletting wasn't practiced because they thought that blood was harmful to humans. They thought that bloodletting was helpful because illnesses were caused by an imbalance of elements called humors. Of course, it's ridiculous, but it has nothing to do with this verse. Please don't act like it hasn't been long since we figured out that blood was important.
Again, the Bible knows best. What about Leviticus 11:33? It says, every earthen vessel whereinto any of them falleth, whatsoever is in it shall be unclean, ye shall break it. Now the very next verse says that if it's clothing or something you're not going to be eating out of, wash it, use it again. Doesn't matter, right? But it's very specific. If a dead thing falls into an earthenware pot, break the pot. Why? Is our Creator just trying to put rules and regulations, just trying to make us oppressed? No. There was a very specific reason he said this.
He goes on to explain that this is because the pots that were used at the time were porous and bacteria could easily seep into them. But what he fails to realize is that that verse only applies to when dead, creeping things fall into the pot, not anything else, because those animals were considered unclean. And the biblical concept of being unclean is far from scientific. Yes, it does include lots of dead animals and carcasses, but also certain animals like the creeping animals and animals that walk on four paws. Not only that, but women who are menstruating and anything that they even touch, or men who have ejaculated. They're unclean. This is not a major scientific idea. This is a primitive system of government.
The Bible knows best. What about Job 26? It says he stretches out the north over the empty place and he hangs the earth upon nothing.
Well, this verse is actually pretty expertly cherry-picked. Yes, it does say that the earth is suspended on nothing, but this is one verse, and the only verse that says such a thing, in contrast with the many verses that say that the earth is suspended on pillars, or laid on top of a foundation. And there are many, many verses which allude to such ideas, including some within the same book. And those ideas are reminiscent of what they actually believed, the ancient Hebrew model of the universe. It's not on top of elephants on top of a turtle. It's a bubble within a cosmic ocean on top of pillars. But I guess Bible knows best, even if it does contradict itself.
The Bible knows best. If we look at Isaiah 40, it talks about he that sitteth upon or dwells over the circle of the earth. Did Columbus really think that he was going to fall off the edge of the earth? That's what I learned in school, in my studies. Probably many of you will learn that. It's not true. Let's take a look.
Okay, I'll spare you from this, but what he does is instead of presenting some information himself, he instead shows a video of him presenting information himself. I don't understand it. It makes no sense. But he goes on to explain that we have known that the Earth was a sphere for a long time, with Aristotle being the first to provide scientific arguments for it.
Have you not known? Have you not heard? Our Creator told us it's a circle. It's a globe.
No, he said it's a circle, which I don't know why this is difficult to understand, but a circle and a globe are two totally different things. The Hebrew word that is used in this verse, according to Strong's Hebrew, comes from a word that means to draw around. It's planar.
The Bible knows best. Okay, so let's move right along. Let's look at a couple others. Job 40 says, "Behold now Behemoth, which I made with thee. He eateth grass as an ox. Lo, now his strength is in his loins, and his force is in the navel of his belly." So some Bible commentators would look at this passage and they said maybe it's talking about an elephant, because an elephant does have a lot of strength in his belly, of course. In Argentina, they found one of the most complete skeletons of Dreadnoughtus, the Titanosaurian sauropod, 85 feet long from head to tail, weighing about 120,000 pounds. That's about as big as 10 elephants, in weight at least. You can see him standing up next to a human right here. But I'm not looking at that. I'm looking at his tail. Could he sway that like a cedar tree? I think he could.
Okay, but there's a few problems with that. For one, at the age in which these animals were dated, there were absolutely no traces of humans from that time period. But also, the verse says that the behemoth eats grass like an ox. The Dreadnoughtus eats trees. But I also think it's curious as to why you decided to talk about behemoth, which is the more vague of the two creatures that it talks about. In the next chapter, it talks about the Leviathan, which we know to be a Hebrew mythological creature.
The Bible knows best. 2 Peter 3 says, "Whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished." So there's a global flood account in Genesis 6 that speaks of a deluge that literally reshaped the planet. It was a catastrophe. But if this is true, then there ought to be some evidence. There's a lot of evidence.
All right, let's hear it.
And I only want to look at just a couple. Let's take a look at clams in Kansas. Clams in Kansas indicate catastrophe. Now, I've participated in some paleontological digs in Kansas for several years now, looking at some of these giant marine predator animals. Some of them grew up to 60 feet long in the middle of Kansas. But also in the middle of Kansas, we find closed clams. Giant fossilized clams turned to stone in the closed position. Because when a clam dies, the muscles relax right here, and the clam opens up. And then over the next few days, few hours, whatever, it disintegrates, the muscles disintegrate, and then you've got the two halves of the clams. What about closed clams in the fossilized closed position? That means that these clams had to be buried extremely rapidly under tremendous amounts of mud and pressure, or else they would have opened up. It sounds to me like a catastrophe, possibly a very large flood. And again, the thing to remember is that these clams are found in the middle of Kansas, about 1,000 miles from the nearest ocean, and about 2,500 feet above sea level. We're even finding fossilized sea creature remains on the tops of Mount Everest and these other high mountains. And there's really no explanation except to say that there was a lot of water there.
Actually, we do have other explanations for that. In fact, we have a better one that doesn't assume that 3 times the amount of water that we actually have just magically appeared and magically subsided. Tectonic plates, right? They move. The land that was once underwater may not be underwater anymore because it has moved. But as far as finding fossils of clams that are closed, the reason that the clams open when they die is because there's a certain ligament that puts pressure on the clam to open it. If that ligament is destroyed when it dies, then there's no reason for it to open. But sure, it could be buried. But here's one thing that you might not know about clams. They bury themselves while they're alive. They live under the sediment of the sea floor. So it's not difficult to think that sediment could somehow cover them up. And the world flooding over is not a better explanation for that.
Let's look at one more, and that is polystrate trees. But you see, that's huge. It's a big fossilized tree standing upright through multiple layers of hardened strata. Now, if you ask a secular geologist today, those who want to explain everything naturally, and you know what they say? Oh, no, what? You're actually right, David. It was a local flood. But the thing is, I read in my Bible that there was a flood that really did reshape the planet.
Oh, okay, I didn't realize that the entire world flooding over all at one time is a better explanation than localized floods, which we actually do see happen and is completely possible. But if the only reasonable explanation for polystrate trees is the entire world flooding over, then how are there polystrate trees in several different stratigraphic levels? Maybe the Bible doesn't actually know as much as you think it does.